Welcome to Talking in a Time of Uncertainty. I'm your host, Lucas Dodson. My guest, Dean of Northwestern Medill School, Charles Whitaker. Thank you for coming on the show today.
Thank you for having me, Lucas.
And for those that may not know Dean Whitaker, he's the dean, like I said, of Northwestern's Medill School of Journalism. He joined the Medill faculty in 1993 and was a professor until he was named dean in 2019. He has worked with news outlets around the country, such as the Miami Herald and the Louisville Times. Dean Whitaker has contributed articles to the Chicago Tribune, the Chicago Sun-Times, Chicago Magazine, Jet Magazine, and Essence Magazine, and the Philadelphia Inquirer. Dean Whitaker, you received your bachelor's and master's degree from Medill and have a lot of experience in that industry. But what led you to teach and get into education?
Oh, wow. That was actually serendipitous. I had absolutely not planned to go to education at all. I was a young parent. My kids were 3 and 4. I was working for Ebony Magazine at the time. I was traveling all over the country and internationally. It was a fantastic job, and I really loved it. But I worried about being an absent father. And I really wanted to be a part of my kids' lives and coach Little League and be at basketball games and all that sort of stuff. And out of the blue, the then dean of Medill, a guy named Michael Janeway, came. They were looking for a magazine instructor. Although I worked in newspapers early in my career, my specialty is actually magazine writing and editing. They were looking for a magazine instructor. He was pointed to me by some former instructors of mine, some former professors of mine, and he came calling and asked me if I would consider teaching. I'd never given it a thought before, but I said this could be an opportunity for me to change course a little. I thought teaching would still enable me to continue writing, but I would have more time at home with my kids, and so I just gave it a shot and signed on board.
And where was Ebony Magazine headquartered?
It's based in Chicago. So it's here. I was already in Chicago at that point. But again, traveling a lot.
Yeah, and was there any other journalistic opportunity, like with something like the Chicago Sun-Times or the Chicago Tribune that you?
No, I was a magazine person. I was pretty satisfied with my magazine job. I mean, even though again, as I said, I'd gone to work in newspapers immediately out of school, I always knew I wanted to be a magazine writer and magazine editor. That was my goal. That was my concentration when I was in graduate school at Northwestern. And that was where I wanted to be. So once I got to Ebony, I was actually absolutely where I wanted to be, doing that kind of writing and reporting.
And what was that first class that you taught at Northwestern?
I started teaching 2 classes: news writing, which is back then was the sophomore class in basic news writing. No, well, not basic news writing. That was slightly advanced news writing, government reporting, document searches, that sort of thing. But I also taught magazine editing, which was just a class in manuscript correction and working with writers and helping writers to improve their rough drafts. Those were the first 2 classes that I began.
So you definitely got to start with something that you were comfortable with and was in your field.
Absolutely.
That's great.
Yes.
That's great. And that definitely probably helped with a little bit of the uncertainty, I could imagine, going into a new job. And
although the thing about being when you're a professional and you've been doing journalism for a long time, when you start to teach it, you have to take a step back and deconstruct this thing that you've been doing and try to deliver that in a meaningful way to students. And early on, I had never taught before, and they had just sort of thrown me into the classroom and trying to figure out how to communicate effectively this thing that I have been doing for the past 10 years was a bit of a struggle at first. So there was a lot of trial and error in those early years of teaching.
And I can imagine, with something like journalism and magazine writing, editing, like something that you've been doing just so naturally all that time. Yeah,
exactly.
Like you said, being able to just look back and try to strip it down to like the basics. That's always I even find that hard when I'm explaining to my parents how to do a certain thing on the phone, because I'm like, oh, you just click here, and go there. But it's not that simple to them. So yeah, that's definitely a struggle. And was there any moment, looking back at your early career, like with journalism, was there any moment of uncertainty that you think shaped you into the person, or I guess educator that you are today? And what role has uncertainty played in your career?
Oh, that's a really good question. It's interesting because as a journalism student and early in my career in newspapers, I wasn't always sure that I was going to stick with journalism, partly because I am naturally shy and introverted. I really, and I remember my first big story as an intern for the Chicago Tribune. It was a big fire story, and I tell my students this all the time. And so I go on the scene of this fire. The fire's raging. I'm a nervous wreck, and the fire marshal. I've got this is pre-recording. So you're mostly taking notes in a reporter's notebook. The fire marshal sort of grabs my hand and says, "Okay, look, kid, this is what you want to know." And he sort of dictated my story to me because I was such a wreck trying to get this information from him. So that kind of uncertainty plagued me. And early in my newspaper career also, the cold call was very tough for me. Just sort of making the cold call to a source, picking up the phone. "You don't know me. I'm so-and-so from the Miami Herald." Was a struggle initially. But I'm glad I did it. The one thing I'm glad, even though I always knew, so I always fancied myself a writer, someone who could paint beautiful word pictures and not necessarily a tremendous reporter. I'm glad that I started in newspapers as opposed to magazine writing, because as a magazine writer, I had learned to write around the reporting holes. I could fill the page with pretty pictures and not always do the deepest reporting. But newspaper reporting really got me out of my comfort zone. It pushed me to be a better reporter. It pushed me to make the cold call. It pushed me to pound the pavement and go out and get the story. And I think I was better served when I moved into magazine, having done that kind of work early in my career.
And when you were with newspapers, did you really focus on like the news section of it? So you were in that kind of reporting?
Yeah, I started as an education reporter in Miami, which was a good place to start because education reporting allows you to do a lot of news, but I also was able to do a lot of features. I loved doing like kids stories and going into classrooms and that kind of stuff. So it was a good combination of my strengths, I thought. And then I moved into municipal reporting, and it was cops and courts. It was really kind of basic hard news reporting. And I did that for about 3 years in Miami before I went to Louisville. And when I went to Louisville, I went back to features, but still a fair amount of news coverage. I was on a team that was covering the implantation of the first artificial heart. And so I did a lot of medical news coverage when I was in Louisville.
And, I thought it was interesting you said about the kids and how you loved going to those classrooms.
Yeah.
It seems like the seeds were kind of being planted right there for what you ended up doing. Well, they're not little kids anymore.
No.
They're college students. But
yeah.
The other question I have is the Miami Herald. So you started there, then you went to Louisville. Those are such different cities, such different environments. What kind of role did that play in your development? Having to change markets and change environments so drastically.
It wasn't so much the change of markets as it was the change of jobs. So when I left, as I said, I was trying to get to magazines as quickly as possible. My goal was to be a long-form magazine writer. In Miami, I was strictly a news reporter. I got to do features every now and then. I actually won a magazine writing award for an education piece that I did when I was in Miami, but I wasn't doing enough of that kind of writing and reporting. A job opened in Louisville on something called their enterprise features staff. And what they did was they scoured around and tried to find great young writers who would sort of write about the changing nature of Louisville. That was our charge. Louisville was actually, even though it's a mid-sized town, it was a town that was sort of dynamic. It had sort of interesting racial dynamics. It had interesting politics. It was Kentucky's kind of a border state, so it's part Southern, part Midwestern, and there are tensions around that. And so it was a very different job. I was no longer on a daily deadline pace. I now had a little more time to develop stories than I did in Miami. And so the difference for me was more the responsibilities and the way the job played out as opposed to the cities. I will say, I was in Miami in the early 1980s. It's a very different Miami than it is now. At that point in time, it was a drug capital. It was desolate. You didn't have all the beautiful people there. South Beach was in decay. It was really crumbling at that moment in time. And so Miami wasn't kind of the southern playground that it is now. It was a really, really kind of fading city, moving between, it had a heyday in the 1950s, and it moved from that period to the Miami Vice period of the early 80s. And I was there in the Miami Vice period, which made it a very, very different environment. So yeah, and Louisville was a different pace, but again, it was more the jobs that were different than the cities.
For sure. And when you went to Louisville, did they reach out to you, or did you directly apply to them to get that job?
I had a friend who was one of my Medill classmates, was working in Louisville at that time on the city desk, and she said she knew that they had this opening, and she knew that I wanted to do feature writing. And she reached out to me and said, there's this great job that I think you're perfect for. You should apply for it. And so I did.
And that's how you got going. And when you went to Chicago, and was Ebony Magazine the first job you had in Chicago, in that area?
It is, yes. Other than I was an intern at the Chicago Tribune, as I said, when I was in college. But that was my first professional job in Chicago.
And did you also get partially through a networking opportunity and like through someone?
Yes. Once again, someone I had worked with in Miami had gone to work for Ebony, and she was leaving that job, actually leaving Ebony to go to the New York Times. And she said, I'm leaving my job. It hasn't been posted yet. You should apply for this if you really want to be in magazines. And so I did. And then I got that job.
Yes. I mean, she just opened the door right there for you.
Yeah. I actually can say I have never gotten a job by like looking at want ads and applying for it. Every job I've ever had in my life has come to me through some connection.
Yeah, see, that's what has been a trend in people I've talked to so far, is that it's just networking is so valuable, especially media and journalism, in places where you can just call up a favor for someone and say this is available. Like that, everyone I've talked to has really shown that value of networking, and I think that's super important,
that's very
especially
true.
with uncertainty, because when you have someone to lean on, not actually to lean on, but more so to help you out if you need to get to the next step, it's so valuable.
It's why it's so important also to make a good impression where you are. I mean, to again, not network for the sake of networking, but actually building relationships. Relationship building is really important because again, that's how opportunities oftentimes come to you. It's not, I tell people it's not a bad thing to be considered a decent person. So being a decent person will hold you in good stead in your life. There are jerks who actually do manage to succeed, but I think more often than not, if you're kind of a good person, good things will come to you.
Yeah.
Not that I'm all good, but I've been very lucky as well.
If you're a good guy, people want to help you out. That's for sure.
Yeah, exactly.
So let's transition to your time at Northwestern and actually to the present day. Because on that topic of uncertainty, there is so much going forward, especially into this 2020-2021 school year. So how have you and the rest of your Northwestern colleagues been preparing for this year? And what do you guys think about the possibilities of possibly going to school? I've heard University of South Carolina, they had the plan to go till Thanksgiving break, then send kids home when flu season hits to go virtually. So what are you guys planning on doing, and what have you done?
We're thinking about something very similar. We're thinking about, we may even start remotely, slowly bring kids back and try. We're on the quarter system, and then end the quarter at Thanksgiving, which would require starting a little earlier for us in order to get 10 weeks in. We usually don't start till the end of September. Yeah. We may start at the beginning of September so that we can get 10 weeks in and wrap up by Thanksgiving. That's a little tricky because how do you turn a switch and go from remote instruction to in-person instruction? You think about those a little differently. So we're requiring faculty to think a little more nimbly about their classes and the classroom experience. But that's what we anticipate doing in the fall.
For sure. And like that transition that you were mentioning, possibly bringing people on slowly but surely to campus, how exactly do you envision that happening? Because I can't imagine you just like select certain people to come on, or is it just randomized?
No, we're thinking about doing it by class. So bringing the freshmen and sophomores in first, and then bringing the gradually folding the upperclassmen in.
I see, like the people who almost need to get their foot in the door a little bit more.
Exactly. That's right.
Yeah, and back to journalism. In a time of uncertainty like this, I think you would agree that journalism is so key. And I remember the last time we spoke with each other, we talked a lot about like the truthfulness in journalism and how important that is. And I feel like today more than ever, it is showing how important it is, how valuable it is. So in your career, have you seen any moment like this? I can imagine like 9/11 would be one, where journalism and getting the facts right and telling the public the truth has been so important.
Sure, right. There certainly have been moments like 9/11, moments of crises, 9/11, Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Maria, school shootings. There certainly have been earthquakes and other natural disasters. There certainly have been cataclysmic moments where the importance of journalism has been highlighted. Nothing compares to a global pandemic, though. I mean, sure, I wasn't alive during the world wars, but I think that's the only thing we could possibly compare this to, where everyone, everywhere is affected, and journalism is our lifeline to sort of not only understanding what's happening, but giving us a sense of how we will get past this, what the new normal is going to look like. It's absolutely essential.
Yeah, and I feel like even more so like with the state of political affairs in our country and how things are so divided to the right and to the left, the constant contrast between people's opinions, especially on a topic like this. You have the people who were calling it a hoax in the beginning, those who were saying, lock down the whole country the first day someone got a case. Like that is showing how you got to have that bipartisan news and that bipartisan opinions to really flatter both sides and give them the truth.
Yeah, we need an honest broker in the center of the discussion who is providing us with, a dispassionate but very truthful account that will enable us both as citizens but also as policymakers to make informed decisions.
Yeah, most definitely. And as you know, the class of 2020, you mentioned before we started recording, the class of 2020 at Northwestern. I mean, they're getting affected hard. Class of 2020 high schoolers entering the first phase of our adult lives. Things are changing so drastically and we don't know what to expect going forward. So is there any advice that you would like to share with members of the class of 2020, whether it's college, class of 2020, middle school, class of 2020, or high school?
Sure. What I've been telling everyone is talent wins out regardless of the circumstances, right? Talent and hard work and enterprise will hold you in good stead. So try not to despair. Focus on those things that you actually do have control over. What you have control over is, applying yourself to as many endeavors as possible and doing them well. I don't just mean applying for jobs, but I mean, we're at an age when everyone can publish, right? There aren't that many barriers to publish. So just writing and putting good information out now is a way that you can distinguish yourself, particularly as a journalist and storyteller. Seeking out those networks, because journalism is so fractured right now, because the business model is broken. There are lots of opportunities in this time of disorientation for young storytellers. So reaching out and asking people how you can be of help. Sometimes that may mean, and I hate to suggest that people should give their labor away. I actually am generally opposed to that. But in this moment in time, just again, making those connections that we talked about and making yourself available to people, I think will hold you in good stead down the road. I think people will remember that. They will reach out to you when this passes, and this shall pass. We will get over this. And those connections will hold you in very, very good stead. So try not to wallow in despair. Again, try to control those things that you can control and be enterprising, be industrious. Again, tell stories that aren't being told and put them out there. Put them on your personal webpage. Put them on your Twitter accounts and your Instagram. Demonstrate that you are chronicling this moment in time, in particular because you have a very interesting perspective as the journalists and leaders of the future. Put that out there, and I think you'll be rewarded for that down the road.
Yeah, I think that's great advice because this time so many people are available and we have our entire days ahead of us sitting at home.
Right.
People,
Yeah.
influential people, are sitting in front of their computers all day on Zoom meetings. They're by their emails. So this is a time that's better than ever to reach out, like you said, and really establish
Absolutely.
those connections and just try to like change. Now, I don't know if change is the best word, but just try something new and
Right.
push yourself into different lanes that you never thought you'd be able to do in any other time. So I think that's
Right.
a super good way to look at this time.
Yeah, this is a time when lots of opportunities will present themselves. You just have to look at this. It's difficult, as I said, it's disorienting and dispiriting for all of us, but you have to look at this as an opportunity as well, as an opportunity to chronicle this moment in time. It will be important for us to be able to look back on how we got through this. So again, journalism is very, very important for that reason, not just to be explainers, but also to help us understand this moment, to help us, to analyze it, and again, chronicle what's happening to us.
Absolutely. Well, Dean Whitaker, I thank you very much for your time, for your insights.
It was a pleasure seeing you again.
And I hope everything with your family, with Northwestern, works out in the future and we all get through this stronger and better, come out good on the other side.
Wish you all the best in your future as well.